Welcome to the Coffee and Podcast, where specialty coffee means so much more. I'm your host, Philip Klayman. I'm also the co-founder of Three Tree Coffee, and I'm very excited about today's episode because we're launching a 3-part series on coffee education, where we're going to learn more about where does coffee come from. And so the first one is going to be farm to boat. Then we're going to cover boat to roaster or boat to roast. And then we're going to cover roast to you, the consumer at home. How does the coffee finally get to you? And so this is the start of a 3-part series. And I'm super pumped to have Harry Hutchins here, who is a co-owner and head of relations with Finca Terrerito, which is a farm in Copan, Honduras. And in this episode, we're going to learn more about the farm to boat. Where does coffee come from? The planting, the farming. And I'm super pumped to have him on. Harry, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip, and thank you to the Three Tree community and customers for your support. There is a lot to unpack with that farm to boat, and we're really excited to dive into it today.
Awesome. Well, I'm super pumped as well, and I just got to give a quick shout out to y'all. For everyone who's listening, we love Finca Terrerito. We've been partnering with them for a couple of years now, and we use some of their coffees in our Treehouse blend, in our espresso blend. We've used their black honey processed for a single origin offering that is phenomenal. It's one of my favorite cups. So anyways, we love what you do, Harry, at Finca Terrerito. And so why don't we just start by just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did you get into coffee? Share a little bit more of your story.
Yeah, so I guess to dive into it, talking about the farm, our farm is in the Copan region of Honduras, the western region of the country where a lot of phenomenal growing regions are. And I actually married into the family. My wife is a 5th generation coffee farmer. Her name is Leticia, and the producer of that black honey that Philip was talking about, as probably many of you have enjoyed. But we started in 2018 in the coffee industry to really just see how can we form direct relationships with roasters here in the United States, such as Philip and many other awesome ones. But going from Honduras, from that farm to boat, as we unpack in this episode, there's so many steps, so many places where quality is going to be affected. And so having that full control of that entire supply chain was something that we said, hey, if we could do that, go right from our farm, do all the warehousing ourselves, form the direct relationships. Not only is Philip going to get a much better roast, but he's also going to have a much more transparent relationship with the farmers to be able to have these discussions like we have today of, hey, what's coming up? What's some of the issues that we're seeing from climate change to quality differentiations. So I think that's a little bit of a nutshell of what we do is form direct relationships from our farm right to roasters. And then to you.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. And we're going to get a lot more into the farm. So you married into a coffee family. Before coffee, what was Harry's life like?
So I went from working with coffee beans. I was a bean counter before. So I was actually an accountant. I was a CPA before. I used to be an auditor at a really awesome accounting firm called Ernst & Young, and it kind of sharpened my teeth in terms of the business there. So when I went to college and university, I was originally thinking accounting and finance were going to be my background. I was a accounting major, finance major, and just loaded up on classes just so I could take the CPA. And once I did that, went into the corporate world, did a couple years, mainly doing audits of financial statements, really riveting stuff, before jumping in 2018 with my wife. She used to also be an auditor herself before. And so we said, hey, let's join forces and form this business ourselves. But a lot of that was based off the idea because we saw what was happening down at our farm, a little background into coffee farming in general. Coffee farms are typically in third world countries, and many of these farmers are on small pieces of land. They might not have the resource or infrastructure to get their coffee to market or get their coffee in front of roasters and buyers. So we saw the opportunity that if we went right from our farm to roasters directly, not only are we going to get a much better price for ourselves, but it's going to be a much better quality for the roaster, because typically the way coffee is with so much land, small little landholders, a lot of that coffee is mixed, consolidated. And with coffee being the second most traded commodity in the world, you end up having some sort of, it's just mixed and blended to be kind of a mediocre soup, just because it's a quantity game, not so much a quality game. So that's really where we saw the opportunity to say, hey, let's go directly from our farms, find roasters, because then it's going to be a win-win relationship. I'm able to get a much more fair and better pricing for the hard work that us and the producers are putting into that coffee. And then on the other side, the roaster is getting a much more transparent relationship. So with having a warehouse here as well, it's much with the full control. We're the ones who plant the seeds, the ones who harvest it, export it, import it. That's all of that is within our control to make sure that quality is really key.
Yeah. Very neat. So, and kind of what I hear you saying is a lot of coffee that you can get off the market or most commodity coffees, it's just a homogenation. It's a blend of lots of different types of coffees from lots of different farms at different elevations with different situations and different plant types. And it's almost like if you look at the colors, right? You have all these different colors: red, blue,
Mm-hmm.
green, purple, yellow. And if you blend them all together, they create brown, right? They all start becoming a little more similar
Mm-hmm.
and they look all the same. And what you're saying is, yeah, by really directly sourcing from one farm, you can really taste the uniqueness and the quality of that one farm. And because you're over so much of the process, you're able to make sure it passes all the way through.
Exactly. And so typically what you might get in the store where it just says Honduras or any whatever origin country it is, that really is just a blend. And so, but if you really peel back the layers and go directly to the source and can actually really be able to get it from single lots or from single farms, you all of a sudden, from a farm that's 45 minutes away, you get a whole range of flavors differentiating that you would say this is not from the same country. Even within the same farm, which we'll get into I think later in this episode, is having what can you do as a farmer to affect flavor. So how do we process the coffee, how do we dry it? That's going to yield just a rainbow of different flavors as well. So there's a lot of changes even within the country that you could do based on the variety, based on the processing, etc.
Nice. Okay. Well, so neat. So you married into this coffee farming family. Leticia Lopez, I think you said she was a fourth or fifth generation farmer, but she was doing accounting
Fifth.
for a while. So
Mm-hmm.
what brought you both back into the coffee world, or her back into the coffee world?
So this company is really founded on three pillars, which is improving lives, sustainability, and extraordinary coffee. Extraordinary coffee is really the vehicle that pushes the vehicle of how do we improve people's lives and how do we be more sustainable for the planet. So going down to the farm, visiting the farms, she spent a lot of time of her childhood at the farm and really got connected with the people and the land there. So when we were in accounting, using all our PTO days to go down to the farm, we really saw the opportunity to say, hey, if we can bring coffee directly from our farm to the market, we could really make an impact there. So, because typically, as I said, third world countries, and there's a whole myriad of middlemen that could go from the farm to the exporter. That becomes, unfortunately, really tough for that farmer to have any leverage or say so to get a fair price for them to be incentivized for higher quality. So what we saw was, hey, if we can go directly from our farms or surrounding farmers directly to roasters, cut out a lot of those middlemen and a lot of those kind of redundancies, we can be able to bring more profits back to the farm, and that therefore make it a positive impact. Unfortunately, just where Honduras is situated, the fact that there's not a whole lot of opportunities, especially in rural areas, you're seeing people either leave the cities or leave to go migrate to other countries without having a sustainable long-term future in whether coffee farming, especially up in the mountains. Then they're going to be looking for other things, and you couldn't blame them for that. So our goal was, hey, if we can retain a lot of the talent there, if we can retain more of the profits at the farm, then this is going to make a huge positive impact for the town and for the community.
Absolutely. Makes it more sustainable for the farmer, for you. That makes complete sense. Let's now unpack, and I think we will get back into some of that conversation because I have some questions towards the end that talk about the challenges of farming and things like that. But let's now get a little bit into just give me a brief overview of the steps that a coffee bean takes to get from plant to boat.
It's a lot, and even before we go into the plan, just so the customers and everyone who supports Three Tree could know, there's just so much steps that even go before it's in the tree, the process to get it there. So typically, our life cycle I guess how we make our product and grow the coffee starts about 4 years ago at a minimum. So we start with a small, just a seed of a coffee plant. That's what we end up roasting. But the seeds typically look like this. Got a little bit of show and tell items for you guys. But this is what's roasted. This is a green bean, and then this is the seed within the parchment. This is what we'll actually use to germinate and grow the plant. So this started about 4 years ago. We'll plant them in our little nursery, and we'll sprout out hundreds of thousands, if not tens of thousands of coffee seedlings. And then from there, we let them grow for a couple months before choosing the best and the healthiest looking sprouts. We go out to the fields. And again, remember, we're in Honduras. We're high up in the mountains, typically between 1,000 to 1,400 meters above sea level. And we're going out and all by hand, because there's no machinery that could do this, especially with how mountainous it is. We'll be planting out those seedlings. That was, again, 4 years ago. Then for 4 years, because our farm is certified organic, we're bird-friendly, shade-grown, so we have to really take care of and have extreme precision about what inputs are going into our soil, onto our leaves. So for 4 years, we are organically raising these plants. So what that means is, in the tropics, how fast weeds grow, even in South Georgia, I imagine you get that, where just plant life will grow pretty rapidly. And so we're constantly going through with weed whackers, machetes, and making sure to clear out all those weeds, so there's no pesticides, no herbicides going into the soil. And then in terms of the pests, we're always fighting a range of different pests, such as borer beetles, things like that. And so since we can't use any pesticides, we have to get a little bit creative. And actually, one thing we do is, out of a byproduct of the coffee, what we call the mucilage. It's actually a sticky solution that's kind of it's a runoff of when we're processing the coffee. We'll actually put that in backpack blowers, and that will actually act as organic pesticide. But again, so for 4 years, it's just constant TLC, just hoping that you don't have any disease or any pests come through and destroy your plant. And then maybe in 4 years, you'll be able to start harvesting.
Wow.
So once the plant is old enough to go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to ask, so what, this is wild, right? So, I mean, there's 4 years that there's
Mhm.
investment before there's really even ever the thought of, can I harvest this coffee or not? What's a ballpark percentage of how many of these plants make it? How many of these plants don't?
So that's a great question. I wouldn't know the answer to that one, because again, you're picking the strongest ones. Every now and then we do see different sections of our farm that need a little bit more TLC. So for example, when I was down there about 2 weeks ago, we were having to rip out probably about an acreage size, but it was, again, probably like 45-degree angle slopes. But we were having to rip those out because we found that there's a little bit more aluminum in the soil. So that was hurting the root systems. It was toxic to them. So there wasn't a whole lot we can do. So we actually had to uproot those plants, and then we're replanting and I think adding inputs into the soil to try and help balance out. Or so I wouldn't know. I guess I wouldn't really know the percentage of that one, but it's a really good question. I'll get to the farm team and try and get that answer.
Mhm.
So, but
Yeah.
we have a really good climate, so I don't see as much if it's anything external than just something usually in the soil. Something we do actually also have to worry about, which would wipe out an entire lot or an entire farm, is a disease I was talking about called it's rust or roya. Something that actually attacks the leaves and strips the tree naked, so it wouldn't be able to photosynthesize. So I guid have to dive a little deeper into those numbers, but
Yeah.
stumping me.
Well, no. I mean, this is just fascinating to me, right? Of how much investment goes in up front before you can even really
It's
start
a terrific
thinking.
business plan.
Yeah, exactly. Before you even start thinking of harvest, sounds a little bit like parenting. So much investment
Mhm.
up front, right? And you're wondering is it making a difference? Is it not? And sometimes it takes time to really see
Mhm.
that. So let's kind of unpack a couple things there. You mentioned La Roya, and I remember hearing about this a lot in 2012, 13, 14. Where this, I think it's a fungus, if that's correct. This plant blight was moving through Central America at a pretty fast pace. And I remember talking with a cooperative in Mexico that saw production or output or yield of coffee seeds drop by about 70 something percent. And it was a huge fight to try and get these farms renovated with more disease resistant plants and ones that aren't affected by La Roya. Did you see this affect your farm a lot? What was your journey with that? And is it still an issue today?
So it's always going to be an issue, especially because it's in the region. But a lot of what it is, there is a lot of preventative maintenance that you can do, but it's very tough for the average farmer to do that. What it involves, typically, how the disease spreads is if you're walking through the fields, if it gets onto your jacket or onto your shirt, it could spread. And I would definitely believe that 70% drop in yield. I'm kind of surprised it's not even more because, as I said, it just strips the tree naked. And so what you have to do is either uproot or cut down all the way down to the base and burn the wood just so you can kill that. And then you have to wait another probably anywhere about a year and a half to about 2 years before you can ever see those plants come on back. And that's if you've just cut them down and not had to uproot them entirely. And if you had to uproot them entirely, then you're looking at another 4 years. So what we do at our farm, we have a really extensive maintenance program. It involves just walking the farm constantly, weekly, bi-weekly, just to make sure that if you see it, because you can see it on the leaves, it's usually on the underside. If you see it on the leaves, then getting rid of it. Now, also what we do at the farm is we also have the certain varieties that are resistant to rust. It's royal or rust, and it would be the variety we typically use is Paranema. And that one currently, I believe, I don't think the rust strain has broken into it, but eventually it will. And then we'll have to start looking towards other varieties. So you have to, on the front end, when you're planting, you're just choosing the right varieties. And then continuously just making sure that you don't see that within your trees.
Yep. Wow. So you have these seedlings that you're growing up into a plant. There's risks associated like disease. There's, of course, making sure the soil is adequate for these plants to grow and mature well so they do produce good coffee. You mentioned borer beetles. Tell me about borer beetles.
So again, on the other side, now we're fighting pests. So borer beetles are a small beetle that will actually the reason they're called coffee borer beetles is because they will bore into the coffee cherry and actually have them right here. So after those 4 years, we're able to harvest it. This is one that is been dried out in a natural form, and so this one it typically is like a red cherry, and there's two seeds in there. So with the borer beetles, they would actually bore usually on the tops, and you'll actually see little holes in there, and they'll actually basically eat and bore into the green coffee cherry. So you're having they'll be basically leave little holes or hollow out the cherry, and so you're getting a lot less yield, and it will also throw off your cup. So not something you'd want. So what we typically have to do, as I said, we'll take a byproduct of the coffee processing, which is going to involve once we wet mill it, we get a byproduct called it's called the mucilage or the honey. Very, very acidic, and so if we get that into the water system of rivers, streams, that could be really dangerous. So we actually filter it to either capture some of it or filter it into an area where we grow straw for our farm animals, so it doesn't ever hit any underground water systems or even any streams or rivers locally, just to make sure there's no impact of what we're doing on the environment. We'll take that, spray down the trees with the acidity. It's something they don't really they don't like, and so they'll go away from there. And then in the off seasons, we actually create little borer beetle traps where it's using an old bottle. We'll actually trap the beetles. They'll go there instead, and you'll just kind of have a collection of them. We have a solution in there. I'm not sure what it is, but that's typically what attracts them, and that's the preventative maintenance side to keep them from going into the cherries.
Absolutely. It almost makes me think of carpenter bees. I have carpenter bees at my house that are trying to bore into the wood in different places. And so we put out these traps that basically they'll bore into that instead of our house. And here they are, you're dealing with pests that are trying to literally ruin the crop and eat the cherry and the seed. And I think it's so neat that you use the mucilage from the cherry, and it's kind of a recycling effect, a sustainable effect. Not only is that not going to some possible toxic or just unhealthy sustainable standards for the earth, but you're reusing it for pesticide to try and avoid the borer beetle. So I think that's super neat how you're using the resources you have in house. Okay, so
and so you actually touched on a kind of a good segue from there. So because I think we got on a little bit of a tangent from the process after those 4 years. Once we're able to actually start harvesting, we are going to end up with a lot of byproducts. But to get that, What we do is all by hand because it's so mountainous in our where we're at. Everything has to be hand picked. This actually is not only better for quality because coffee typically doesn't ripen at the same stage. So we'll actually do usually three pass throughs at our farm just to make sure that we're only picking the red cherries. Once those cherries are picked, again, they're going to look like this. This is actually dried out, and this is what we call a natural or dry process. But typically imagine it being a bright red cherry, and if you squeezed it, you would actually both two seeds would come out, and that's what you guys are after with and what's eventually going to be roasted. So we have the natural. So again, it's going to look like this, but bright red. You can pick it off the tree and then you can go right to our patios. So we can go right to the patios or in our case for naturals, typically raised beds to allow this coffee to be dried within the coffee cherry skin. We also have the option to, and I'll tell you in a little bit why we do this. We also have the option to do a honey process, which is this is a red honey, and this was one that actually Philip and crew took, but we've taken off the cherry skin and we actually have left the mucilage on there. Now, how we do that is in what we call a wet mill. So our farm, we've built a lot of this. A lot of our equipment comes, we either built it in-house ourselves or actually got it from Brazil, who produces a lot of coffee. So a lot of the manufacturers for coffee processing equipment comes from there. But it was really tough because we actually had to customize the bean or really the equipment to the Honduran bean because it's a little bit different. Typically, Brazil might be a little bit denser just based on their picking practices. So we needed to customize and calibrate the machines really for the Central American and the high altitude, with the Honduran coffee. And so what we'll do is we'll feed all the cherries into the wet mill, and then through friction, that skin is going to be removed. That outer layer is going to be removed, and you're going to be left with the two seeds. Here's two of them right there. And then they will have this slimy, sticky mucilage around the outside. Right out of in the wet mill, it's going to be wet and just slimy. But then give it about 18 to 32 hours, which is how long we usually ferment it for, and it gives this almost stain, this kind of reddish, blackish stain. And the amount of mucilage you leave on there will affect whether it's going to be anything from a white, yellow to red to black honey. And then from there, we can dry that again on our raised beds. Or the last process where we'll do that fermentation for that 18 to 32 hours, we'll wash that coffee again, and then out we'll take off that mucilage again. And then this is what the wash coffee is. That looks like a peanut. And just so you guys don't think I'm doing magic, to go from this to the green coffee, which a lot of roasters receive, at our dry mill, we'll rip all this off. And then you're left with the green coffee. And then there's the parchment there. So doing that is going to affect a lot of flavor, because if you think about it, drying it in the skin could actually kind of yield a very winey kind of, the skin almost tastes like very fruity, very kind of strawberry, raspberry like. So it's going to give off that very fruit forward, kind of winey, fermented taste, as opposed to the honey, which is going to have almost a sweet mucilage on it. So typically, this is one of my favorite coffees because it's very sweet, tart, almost acidic, kind of think like Granny Smith apple. And then the wash coffee typically has a profile of a more chocolatey, earthy, kind of citrusy flavor to it. At least that's what it is from our farm. So that's why we would do that, because it's going to yield a whole different set of flavors, and it allows us to kind of experiment to then bring something new to the market to say, hey, this is the art that goes behind the farming. And then going back to the point about sustainability and keeping everything, you're going to have byproducts from all of this. So for example, when we get that mucilage, that honey runoff, when it's fermenting, then you're going to have that's organic pesticide. Now, in terms of the cherry skin, we call this cascara, and we actually have a center at our farm where we'll take all of this and use it, the outer layer, the skin. We'll actually use it as organic composting. We actually will compost it to create more soil for organic material that will actually spread out into the field. So we just want to make sure that we're not bringing any inputs into that. If we're taking stuff from the field, we're immediately putting it back through the organic compost. So we have the composting, we have the pesticides, and then that parchment that I took off, Typically, our picking happens between November through February, which also coincides with our rainy season. And drying coffee in the rain is one of the most difficult things. So we actually have to use some mechanical dryers, and those mechanical dryers feed off that parchment or this once it's dry milled to then fuel. And those typically will be running for, depending on the size of the batch, typically about 70, 80 hours. And so that's a lot of parchment we're going through. So there is literally no waste, and anything that is going out. So for example, like the mucilage, that the pH is so high, it's so acidic. If it got into the water systems, would destroy an ecosystem. We'll filter that to go into an area where we just farm our straw and hay for the animals. So either nothing's going to get wasted, or there's going to be no impact to the environment. So a big push on sustainability.
Wow, love that. Y'all clearly have such a holistic approach to this, right? Of no waste, making sure you're taking care of the environment, taking care of people, taking care of the customer, and making sure it's a good product. A very whole picture to say we're going to do this right and do it the right way. And so, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I love what you just unpacked. So from the plant, we've got these cherries that are harvested. You kind of mentioned three layers to this cherry. We got the literal outer part of the cherry. Would that be called the pulp as
Mm-hmm.
well? Is that correct?
You can call it that. I've heard a whole number of names. I just call it either the skin or cascara. That's another word for it. But yeah, the outer skin.
Perfect. So the skin or the cascara, and then within that, you've got
Mm-hmm.
kind of the slimy mucilage, and that's what you're saying you reuse as the
Yeah.
fertilizer. And then within that, you have something called the parchment, which is kind of more of a papery, I think you said peanut shell type of thing. You ripped it off yourself on
Yep.
camera, so
Exactly.
it must be
Mm-hmm.
fairly brittle and thin. Now, you mentioned
Yeah.
wet milling and
It
dry
is.
milling, and the wet. Oh,
Mhm.
good.
No, I was going to say, and yeah, so you actually were going to lead me into a perfect segue between what you think you're going to ask about the difference between the wet mill and the dry milling. So as I said, as you guys saw, I could do this by hand, even when the cherry is red and fresh. If I squeeze that hard enough, I out two seeds would pop. So you could do it by hand, but essentially through friction is what's taking that off. And so at the wet mill, that's where the difference between those is. It's basically a large wheel that, again, through friction will take off the skin. And then at the dry mill, same thing, a large kind of a wheel with teeth on it. Imagine a large cylinder is what's going to actually take off the dry husk from the seed. And so the difference between those two is the steps of the process. So with the wet mill, it is kind of literal. It's when the coffee cherries are wet. You put it in there, and so there's a lot of um, moisture still in the coffee cherry, and so you're going from the cherry to the final product, which will then be dried. Typically, we want to dry it down to about 11.5% moisture, and at that time, and when we're ready for export, is then when we will do the dry milling, and that dry milling is taking it from this dry parchment, this dry, call it bomba, but natural, the cherry, and there's still two seeds in there, or the dry honey process, and ripping out that outer layer to then just expose us with the kind of inner part of the seed, which is then what I'm going to be sending Philip and his team. So that green coffee is then what is inside all that. And then that's what's going to be roasted. So hopefully that explains it well. It's just kind of the timing and how moist, I guess, the coffee would be.
Yeah, nice. Now, I've seen some different scenarios where sometimes wet milling is done on site or off site, and I've seen dry milling mostly done off site in my experience of the farm. So, from your experience, or I guess on your farm, is the wet milling done on site? Is the dry milling done on site? Is it somewhere else? Does that have to be transported?
Both, both. So all of it happens at our farm. So that's something that we really did through the pandemic. Was we had our dry mill before, and then we had to go do all the. I mean, we had our wet mill on the farm before, and that's where we had to do all the stuff. And then through the pandemic, we constructed our exporting facility that then uh, that we then would start exporting and doing all the dry milling internally.
Gotcha. Nice. Okay. So dry milling versus wet milling, super fascinating. I think my next question would be, we've talked a little bit about flavor. How does all this affect flavor? And you've talked a lot about the processing affecting flavor. And like you said, so we get your washed coffee and a Honduras, or sorry, and a honey processed coffee from you. And they do have
Mhm.
wildly different flavors. So processing can clearly affect the flavor profile, as you said. What other things can affect the flavor profile when it comes to the farm level?
So I would definitely say one of the biggest things is where the farm is located. So we're talking about altitude. So that typically results in a little bit more of acidic coffee. So you guys actually take two coffees, both from our high altitude farm. Those again come with a little more of a floral, more acidic kind of flavor note to that one. Now, wherever our lower altitude farm, you're typically getting a little bit more kind of those rounder chocolate, more chocolate, think chocolate notes to it. So altitude and location of where the farm is going to have a huge effect on flavor. The other one is going to be what comes to mind is the variety. So different varieties will have different almost cup profiles. So as we typically do Padanema, it's one that we really favor because it's rust resistant, so it's hardy towards diseases. But then it has a really nice kind of really sweet cup profile. The Padanema variety actually won, I believe it was a couple of years ago, a Cup of Excellence award in Honduras, and fetched a very high sum at auction, and that was very different than what's been happening in the past, where you're seeing geishas and those varieties win, but coming out with the Paranema to win a couple of years back was pretty cool. So variety, altitude, where the farm is located, and then I would talk about the maintenance program. So how is the farm being cared for during those times of the March through October timeframe, where the coffees haven't been harvested, or they're still ripening, because the tree is going under so many different stresses. In the summertime, it doesn't have a lot of rain, so you know we have actually irrigation in our farm to just make sure that the trees always have those nutrients, and then also how full, how compact and how close the trees are, together would actually affect, or really how well we've pruned and maintained the trees, because we always want to make sure that um, the beans go from the most powerful stalk that'll bring the nutrients to those cherries. So I'd say your maintenance program has a huge effect, and then lastly, I would say is in terms of the processing, what we can do at the farm. Obviously, we wash everything and do it with the whole wet milling process. We do that all with a well that was dug about 400 feet down into the earth. So we're getting clean water that is being brought up to wash the coffee. You have to use a lot of water to actually have for both fermentation, as well as it it actually helps move the coffee through the machinery. And so typically what you see in most places that it's going to be stream water and from or fed from streams or rivers. That a couple years, decades ago was okay. But now, unfortunately, we have a lot of pollutants and a lot of other additives into the rivers. Who knows what the farmer upstream is doing from you. That if you put your coffee in there, you could end up with a lot of microbial growth. So what we did was we drilled down about 400 feet, installed a pump, and we have a well that water is actually clean enough to drink, and that's the same water that coffee is being washed with. And then from there, it's just how we dry it, making sure that you're getting proper turning to make sure you're actually getting proper drying, so that the moisture gets down to the proper percentages. And then finally, I would say in storage, we store both at the farm in parchment right before export, as well as here in the United States. We have a fully climate controlled warehouse that whenever Philip gives the word, send coffee over. But it's all fully climate controlled, and we're always monitoring the coffee just to make sure that there's no spikes in moisture, or any dry spells, because that'll kind of mute out a lot of the kind of kill a lot of flavors that you would have from there. So how many different things have I rattled off? I'm probably on like number 7 or 8, but all of those will affect flavor. But especially at the farm, I would say some of the biggest ones would be where it's grown, the variety, and then what you choose to do with it after it's picked and how you decide to process it.
Wow. So if anyone's listening to this and they're like, yeah, my coffee is just a morning cup, I press a button or I maybe just do something real quick, think about all the steps that it took to make that one cup, right? We have borer
Mm-hmm.
beetles and rust, and we have moisture content and processing, and we have equipment. You mentioned all sorts of different types of equipment. You have maintenance schedules to make sure that things are staying on track. You have different types of coffee plants, different types of coffee growing regions. Amazing how much all goes into producing a good quality cup of coffee. Now, I'm imagining like the harvest season. It's got to be like almost like Christmas, like this exciting time of it's time for harvest. And I think you said y'all go out 3 times during harvest season so that you're only picking the ripe cherries. Is that an exciting season? Is that a stressful season? What is harvest like for you? And when is that in Honduras?
I'm trying to figure out the emotion just because again, most of the team is the one who's really involved with that. But I would say it always, there is so much stress going into it because of, you have been working for a whole year to get that harvest. You have really one shot. And I think it really just culminated out, like I said, it's unfortunately just stress because have you ever grown tomatoes or anything like that?
Yes. Yes.
So have you ever had tomatoes after, your tomato plants after a rainstorm? And you'll actually see those tomatoes will split. So
Yeah.
it's a very stressful time because we have the ripe cherries on the tree and you're having a time. So we need to have about 200 pickers that come to do everything by hand. It's not something that we can just do by ourselves. And so we're constantly having a time. Hey, do we have enough labor to help us out and help us pick? And if we get any sudden rainstorms, so a couple of years ago, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a strong hurricane that came through, dropped a torrential amount of rain on the farms. We lost about 30% just because we couldn't get the coffee off the trees. We had the harvest. Everything was going great, but because it accelerated the ripening with the rain, it was whatever Mother Nature does and whatever science is behind the ripening process to go from red to like the maroon color, which is what we want to pick. When that rain hits, all of a sudden those cherries are then filled up with water and they could split and then rot on the tree. And so I would definitely say that a lot of the feelings around it is just stress and just hoping that Mother Nature doesn't throw a curveball our way with a hurricane or something crazy. And if we don't have the folks and the people to help us, then even if we have the best harvest ever and we can't get it off the tree, it's going to be done. So those 3 pass-throughs, I just want to quickly kind of clarify for the audience here is we'll do one pass through to get any of the premature coffees. So that's coffees that have maybe ripened just a little faster. Maybe let's say, just Mother Nature does her things and, all the other cherries are green, but all of a sudden there's just this one red cherry. But by the time we get to it, it's going to be rotten and go bad. And that would really throw off your cup. You wouldn't want that bean. So we have to do one pass through to clean up everything and take everything off from red to dried out cherries to anything that just doesn't look appealing. That will typically stay in domestically or in the country, or typically we'll ship it off to be made for buyers who want instant coffee or very, very cheap coffee. So that's what we call resaca. And then let's go into the second harvest. That's the bulk of our harvest. That's the good quality coffee that's going to make it out to the US. That's typically going to be happening around December, January timeframe. So that's where we're picking and even actually right about now, our ripening this year is a little bit faster. So right now, we're about to go into our second pass through, and that's going to be the biggest bulk of what we take. That's going to be the best coffee cherries. That's going to be our busiest time. And then in the late harvest season, we do a third pass through. So as we talked about earlier in this episode about the borer beetles, well, if you don't take off the cherries and the ripe ones, that's going to be a place where pests and insects can get into. So we have to do a third pass through to take everything off to let the tree then start fresh with a blank slate to then produce that next harvest. So it's not like all of them are going to be as crazy, and the objectives for each one are a little bit different. But I would say it's a really stressful time. It starts, as I said, 3 a.m. to you're making breakfast, go out to the fields, and then by evening time, then you gotta start processing coffee. Once you pick it, you need to process it under 24 hours. We do it the same day, every single day from 6 to 10 midnight, depends on how much you've picked, to make sure that you can process the coffee so it doesn't ferment and potentially have something that would would throw off the cup. So we process all, put it out into the patios, and then start the day again. And then the coffee that's on the patios would take a couple of days before we put it in our tumble dryers to then get it down to the moisture level that we want, which is at 11.5%.
Well, that does sound stressful. I can't imagine, right? How much goes into
Yeah,
that time frame.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so
So
it just imagine that's so it's why buying directly from the farmers is important, or why supporting farmers as opposed to all the intermediaries and all that is really important to the industry, because could you blame them if the coffee pricing, I think the commodity market um is hovering around the buck 60 buck 70 range. That's below the cost of production for at least for Central America. So we don't support the farmers, there is very little incentive for them to continue producing extraordinary naturals, honeys, because of just how hard those are. Even the wash, it's all an extreme amount of hard work.
mhm, yeah. So there's so much more we could unpack there, but let's start to round this out. So I have just two more questions
hmm
for you. The first one would be, what do you think is one of the greatest challenges facing coffee farmers today?
I would definitely say it's the consumer. I think if the consumer was you know really delve into all the steps, and just watching this episode, you as a consumer are going to be way ahead of the average one that knows where coffee comes from. Most people are really surprised when they find out it's something that has to be roasted. They're surprised when they find out it's grown on a tree. And so for us as farmers, it's really challenging if the consumer is not educated on or demanding from their roasters, hey, who is this coffee farmed by? Where is it grown? What is the relationship that you as the roaster have with the farmer, just to make sure it's ethical and sustainable? Because without without the consumer asking for, hey, can we want to see this direct trade, we want to see farm direct relationships. It's hard for the majority of roasters that don't share the same values as Three Trees, that want to make a huge impact, that want to change lives. If the consumer doesn't ask for that, then the farmer is still going to continue to starve. They're going to still continue to suffer. So that would be the biggest one, is to try. And I really challenge, the Three Tree community and all the other roasters or all the other consumers of coffee in the world to say, hey, this is really where coffee comes from. And what's the true price of coffee that we're paying for? If we go to the grocery store and buy it for $5, there's you're going to continue you're going to have to pay for that some other way. A farmer is then going to have to cut corners. They're going to have to cut down rainforests. They're going to have to cut down our forests to make sure that we get more yield per acre. Us at Finca Terrerito aren't going to do that because we have the amazing support of Philip and his team. But if we don't, we're either going to have to pay for it with deforestation. We're going to have to pay for it with potential crime, because if there's no jobs in coffee farming, we're going to have to figure out to do something else. All of that will come back to bite us if consumers aren't educated on it and want to pay a fair price at the counter, because that's going to then turn around and have Philip, pay myself, pay other farmers a much higher price, because consumers are asking for it. So
Yeah.
um, that'd be the biggest challenge.
Yeah. It's what I hear you saying is, sometimes people don't want to spend more on their food, right? And I mean, we get it. We cherish our money, right? And we want to use it for other
hmm
things. And at the same time, what I hear you saying is, if it's not a cost at the counter, it's going to be a cost somewhere else. And that can have collateral damage, whether
hmm
it's hurting the
Exactly.
environment, whether it's hurting other people. Is this industry sustainable in this way? And so there's going to be a cost somewhere. The question is where. And yes, it is worth investing in quality. It's worth investing in relationships. It's worth investing in these sorts of systems that's just holistically taking care of people. I love that answer. Okay, so then my last question would just be, what do you think the future of coffee farming looks like? If you could map out coffee farming over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you see coming?
So I see a split right down the middle, and hopefully, if the consumer is asking for it, if roasters like yourself or any other ones are able to pay a sustainable price for that coffee, I think we can go a really good way, where it's going to be more of a focus on you know ethics and sustainability, not sustainability just on terms of the planet, but also on the human side as well. That we can, if we can retain talent, especially in origin countries, and as well as um, have great relationships like we can push quality of our coffee. I could tell you 5 years ago, where our coffee is scoring is way higher, because we have the support and the investments from roasters just like yourself, that are, hey, I see what you guys are doing, I want to support this, and I'm not just going to buy from you once. You guys, we've been working together for you know I think even before the pandemic, so having those relationships, that's going to get people to continue farming. The average age of the coffee farmer is continuing to grow. So if we do, have build more relationships with like what we're doing, um, um, you know, we're able to, have roasters, pay a higher price or want to support more direct trade, then the industry can go into a really cool space. Now, on the opposite side of it, and one that I do really fear is, as Phil kind of touched on, if you don't, and what I was talking about earlier is if you don't pay at the counter, you're going to have to pay a different way. And one of those is going to be in terms of quality. And so if the quality of the coffee, we might have, the amount of coffee that is being consumed in the world is continuously going up. The average age of the coffee farmers is also going up. Most young folks do not want to get into this industry. If that continues, we're going to lose a whole wealth of knowledge, generational experience. And then if we, are using and putting in so much bad inputs like fertilizers, pesticides into the ground, you are going to get a decrease in quality. So although you might not see the effect on your wallet, you will on your taste, because it's either you either pay for it or it's not going to be very good. So that's the other side of the industry if we continue to potentially go down the same way we're going. But I think seeing able to do podcasts like this, seeing the work that you, Philip, are doing with trying to raise awareness of from the tree to the cup. Hopefully the first scenario is what's going to happen. So I really appreciate you doing this.
Absolutely. Well, and you've said it a lot. It all really does come back to partnerships, right? We all need to start working together to create the future that we want to see, right? That includes coffee. We all want coffee to still be around. It includes good coffee.
Good coffee.
Yeah, exactly. But also includes healthy people, healthy situations. And I just love it. Harry, I've learned a ton today. I know some of this. I've been to farms before. Some things that were new to me. Had no idea that La Roya literally could just be carried off clothing from one plant to another. That's wild. Love hearing about how you're using the mucilage as fertilizer and that reduce reuse situation. Just so many amazing things that are inspiring. Appreciate what you're doing and really appreciate you being on this podcast today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And a huge challenge to the folks that are hearing this. If I'm not too forward, Philip, we've talked about the washed honey is natural. Next time you go into Three Tree, ask to try one of those. And I don't think you've picked up a natural, but this is my little sales pitch to try and say, hey, next time you're in there, let Philip know that you'd love to try some. It's really cool because you get to try all the different processes. So hope that doesn't cause more homework for you, Philip. But
nice. No, love it. Take the opportunity while you got it.
All the consumers. Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome, man. Well, so cool. Well, once again, we love what y'all do. Appreciate you being on. To everyone that's listening, just want to do really quickly, just ask, we've been doing this podcast for 3 or 4 months now. I would love it if you could please just help us out and spread the word. Like, subscribe, follow, click those buttons. It just helps a ton for us to get the word out about what we're doing here. If you like the podcast and want to leave us a review, please do that. And otherwise, it was awesome having Harry on. And we're going to see y'all next time.